You know, Dr. Hudson, you gave a very good illustration in one of your articles, I think your article on Iceland, to explain to people why asset inflation is not good. You wrote, and I think this is instructive for people to understand. It says, consider an attractively priced home. Would you rather own 100% of a home free of all debt with a market value of 100,000 euros if free of debt, or would you rather own 60% of the same home at an inflated market value at 250,000 euros? In the second scenario, you would have 50,000 euros of surplus wealth, because obviously the price, the so-called value of it would be higher. You've got 60% times 250,000 equals 150,000 euros compared to 100,000 in the first example. So, I mean, even though you only own 60% of the house, it was still supposedly worth more. Then you go on to say, people across the globe have been convinced that the second scenario represents wealth creation. What is overlooked is that the higher-priced home carries interest charges on its higher market price. This charge would amount to 6,000 euros a year, or 500 euros a month, at 6% interest. The same property is worth more, but includes a much larger debt overhead income for the financial sector. So that all that's happening really is that you owe the banks more in interest. Is that right?
That's right. The same thing is here for dollars. And that's the thing. The idea of buying real estate, especially if you're an investor like Donald Trump or a commercial investor, the idea is that rent is for paying interest. And basically landlords will go out, they'll look at a building, they'll calculate how much rent is available after they meet the carrying charges, and they'll pay all of this rent to the bank as interest in exchange for a loan to buy it. And they're willing to give all this income to the bank in exchange for selling it at a capital gain, because they think, well, as interest rates come down more and as the economy's inflated, I'm buying an inflation hedge and I can always sell at a capital gain. And the government encourages this, and the government encourages it in two ways. First of all, it only taxes capital gains at half the rate of earned income, wages and profit, and in fact it doesn't collect capital gains tax at all if you just reinvest your wealth and making more and more wealth. So essentially, your gain is tax-free if you're a real estate investor. And secondly, the government lets interest charges be tax-exempt. Now, everybody in the 19th century, all the major economists since the Saint-Simonians in France, thought that the idea of industrial investment should be that banks should make loans against profit. That way, if the profits go up, the bank gets more. If there's a recession and the profit rate goes down, the bank gets less. Otherwise, you're going to have a forfeiture of property to the bankers. Instead of favoring equity investment, the financial sector has essentially bribed and financed government officials to encourage debt financing. And what that does is load the economy down with debt charges, and whatever is paid as debt is tax exempt, so that the borrower has much more money that he can pay a banker than if he pays dividends on stock, which are paid on an after-tax basis. So there's an asymmetry in the American economy and just about all the other Western economies to favor the bankers in debt instead of favoring equity, and that's why the economies throughout the world are all collapsing under the debt burden today.
Yes, and I believe this subject first came up in a few of our shows several years ago when you were explaining why cutting property taxes doesn't really benefit homeowners or even renters, because all the money that would have gone to pay taxes to the government is now extracted by the banks in interest.
That's exactly right. Whatever the tax collector gives up is free to be paid for the bankers. But meanwhile, since the tax collector isn't getting the property tax anymore. It has to raise the money somewhere else. And either it taxes income, mainly labor income, or it taxes sales, so that sales taxes fall on consumers, or it borrows money from the wealthy people from whom it used to tax. So instead of taxing wealth, it now borrows from them and pays them interest. This is just the opposite of what everybody expected to see under a system of progressive taxation.
Right, and I think it's something that is not obvious to people. They think if their property taxes are low, that they're getting a deal.
In the short term, that's right. So they're taking a phenomenological approach. They look at the surface, and in the short term, of course, if the property tax goes up, they have to pay more. But when things even out, when market forces work, people are not going to be able to borrow as much against the free rent if there's a heavy tax. And ideally, if you had a tax system that collected all of the land rent, then people could borrow from the banks to build buildings and pay a return, but they couldn't borrow against the land's rising site value or price, and the government would have this property tax, which is now a free lunch, and it wouldn't have to levy a local income tax or local sales taxes or the other kinds of taxes that governments levy. They'd tax wealth, which is exactly what happened throughout antiquity, when by far the major tax was fell on the land, because that's where all the wealth was, and that was the only way that you could see how much wealth somebody had. So all of this that we're seeing today, this tax system, turns upside down the kind of tax philosophy that civilization has had for 4,000 years.
As well, you've written that central banks swamp economies with easy credit, that is, with debt, that keeps the financial sector fat while impoverishing the increasingly indebted nation. Is this what is happening today with the bailouts? This sounds like what you've been describing.
Well, yes, but not in the usual way. The bailout does create debt. The government is doing a cash-for-trash swap, where the government takes junk mortgages, many of them fraudulent, many of them about to be prosecuted for criminal felony, I believe, and has given them good government bonds, newly printed, that are going to have to pay interest by levying taxes on the population as a whole. So the banks themselves were supposed to turn around and levy debt. Essentially, what Geithner has said was the solution to an over-indebted economy is lend even more money, inflate prices even more. We've got to make housing prices higher, and lend enough money so they can pay the banks, so that the banks that have been doing all of this crooked activity can continue to collect on the credit that they've created and extract even more from the economy. So Geithner is supporting the financial sector against the rest of the economy, and Obama apparently believes that the best solution for America is to lower wages, take-home wages, and disposable income by about 20%, and give money away to his largest campaign contributors, the financial sector.
You were a balance of payments economist on Wall Street for 40 years. Exactly what was it that you did?
Well, for Chase Manhattan, my job was to look at third world countries and estimate how much can they afford to borrow. And the way in which I do that would, I'd say, how much can they afford to export, how much of their infrastructure can they sell off, and if they can export, say, $10 billion a year, then that will carry a loan at 5% of 20 times that. So that'd be like $200 billion or so. And then I'd calculate what proportion of the overall foreign debt does Chase Manhattan have, and I'd say this is sort of what I believe our quota could be. Underlying that calculation was the assumption that whatever a third world country could generate over and above subsistence, all the income that normally would go to labor would go to paying the banks. All the export proceeds would go to pay the banks. All the profits would go to pay the banks. Everything the government could tax would go to pay the foreign banks. So the idea was how much of a surplus could be squeezed out of these economies, keeping them poor, keeping them in poverty, but enriching Wall Street. And that was how I learned about how to do the balance of payments and how banking worked. I then went to work for Arthur Andersen doing doing the U.S. balance of payments. These were during the Vietnam War years in the late 60s, when I found out that the entire U.S. balance of payments deficit was military in character. The private sector was exactly in balance. The military was running the deficit. And then later on, I continued to do balance of payments consulting, I guess down through the 1990s for Chase and for various Wall Street clients in the intervening decades.